Hello, this is Brian with Ad Fontes. At Ad Fontes, what we do is we go back to the original language of Scripture to try to understand the structure of the text to better understand its meaning. I ran into some difficulties while I was evaluating Romans 3:21 through 26. Those difficulties that help us go deeper into the text of Scripture and understand it a little bit better in its context. And so I wanted to share that with you here in English. We have Romans 3:21 through 26, but as always, we must remember the context. And so let's remember that from Romans 1:18 all the way through 3:18, Paul is putting all Jew and Gentile under sin. And then in verse 3:19 and 20, he touches the fact that the law doesn't save. The use of the law is to expose sin. And another phrase that Paul uses is that it shuts everybody's mouth so that there's no excuse before God. And so even though the law, it was a privilege for Israel to receive the law, it does not give them any brownie points before God's judgment throne. And so from there, we come on now to Romans 3 and verse 21. I'm using the ESV here. We'll probably come back to the NIV here for my own reference. And to show you just a little bit about the original language, I have the Nestle Aland 28 over here. So let's go ahead and start here. One of the main things that I do here is I look at the connectors. These small little words help us to understand how Paul is relating one clause, phrase, or sentence to the other clauses and phrases and sentences. And so before we saw how Paul was talking about the law and how the law exposes sin. It doesn't save by itself, or it doesn't save souls. It cannot justify. It condemns. It shuts mouths. It shuts mouths and it exposes sin. And now Paul moves on in his argument. So the connector used here is de, as you can tell here. And this a lot of times will mean another step. Sometimes we'll see it translated but, sometimes we'll see it translated and, sometimes we'll see it left out of our translations. But it's basically signaling most of the time, I don't have an exact percentage, probably more than 90% of the time, that it's another step in Paul's argument, either in his overall argument, like in a whole letter, or in a shorter paragraph, or it could be showing some relationships even between clauses or phrases. But here, it's another step in Paul's argument. So he had been talking about the law, and that the law exposes sin, and it eliminates all excuses before God. But now, Paul says, the righteousness of God. And so in other words, it looks like that this is contrasting material. So in other words, the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. So in other words, the law did not manifest necessarily the saving righteousness of God, right? But it did, what Paul says here, bear witness to it. There's some things that could be said further because of the structure, but I don't want to go into that anymore here to confuse anybody. Let's just go on to verse 22. Now here, unfortunately, in the ESV, we don't have our connector translated. Our connector, once again, is de, which means another step, right? So here we see that the righteousness is manifested apart from the law, but we see the witness to it in the law and the prophets. But here we find where that righteousness is revealed. It is revealed where? Through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. And so it's not revealed, or it's not manifested in the law, but it is through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Now there's tons of things that could be said here from the original language, but we're just going to go with our translation. And so the righteousness of God is not manifested in the law, but it's manifested through faith in Jesus Christ. Seems to be the idea here. And then Paul comes on here and he has this little word here, for. We should always pay attention to these little words, buts and fors and ands. And in the original language, it's gar, as we see over here. Now this means that it is a supporting argument. And here it's explaining. So why is the righteousness of God revealed through faith in Jesus Christ? And why is it for all who believe? Paul says here, because, or for, there is no distinction. Okay, now we're getting to this part that I found very difficult, but before we get to that, I want to review this and just make this statement that the main argument of Paul in this paragraph is found here. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. This is what Paul is mainly talking about in this whole paragraph. The grammar sets that up. So from here, this is Paul's main idea. And then here he's going to be supporting that, as we saw with this conjunction. So he starts to support those statements. And he says, this is because there is no distinction. And here we have another gar, which means, so he is now telling us why there is no distinction. So this is supporting material, and it is supporting by means of an explanation. So, Paul, why is there no distinction? Well, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so that's another step in his supporting his main idea. So there's no distinction. That's why the righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Why, Paul? Because there's no distinction. For all have sinned. Now, why is there no distinction? Because all have sinned. And here is another interesting thing. This is what really, really, really got me thinking about this passage of Scripture. The interesting thing here is if we look in the original language, what we have is a participle. And so, to make a very wooden translation, we would be able to say here, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified, etc. Being justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. Now, that kind of leaves it out in the open, a little bit more to interpretation than what a lot of Bible translators will want. And so the question that comes to mind here, seeing the grammar and how it is in the original language, is who is the subject? Who is the subject of the being justified? Now, the grammar would tend to make us think it's the all here. And so here's the issue that I was going through. So if this is a statement that all, talking about every person has sinned and falls short of the glory of God, and if we're to isolate that from the context and to go with that, if that's the sense here, then that would mean that all are being justified by grace as well. This does not happen to everybody. So this was my conundrum. So my thoughts and my idea here as I meditate on a passage of Scripture is, who is the all referring to here? Is it to everybody? In a sense it is, right? But remember the context. What is Paul doing here? He is putting Jew and Gentile under sin so that they all have the same need of God's grace. Right? And that is why, even though the material in the original language is not explicit, that's why I think that the NIV makes it explicit here. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile. For all meaning here Jew and Gentile, have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So it's not that every single person is being justified by grace. It is that Jew and Gentile, all of the Jews and all of the Gentiles that are being justified are justified by grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. So in other words, Paul, why is there no distinction? Well, it's because everybody has sinned, both Jew and both Gentile. And that is why everybody has this need of being justified by grace as a gift. So Paul here actually continues, even though he's going on to another step in his argument, he hasn't he's going on to a different idea, right? So it's not just that the law exposes sin and that Jew and Gentile both have their sin exposed, but it's that all have sinned before God's bar, before God's judgment throne, and all have this need of grace. And so here we're not saying that the doctrine of original sin is not true. It's supported in Scripture everywhere. And I think that Paul is thinking on these terms here, but he's applying doctrine of original sin to his argument here, to Jew and Gentile, so that they can both see that they have a need of being justified by grace. So in other words, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. For Jew and Gentile have false sinned and come short of the glory of God. And all of the Jews and all the Gentiles that have ever been and ever will be justified are being justified by grace. And that is because of their sin. There's no other way to be justified. And so I think that is Paul's idea here. And that is the main thrust of Paul's argument. But here we have something very important. This right here is also, now it's wonderful doctrine, and it's coming in to support Paul's argument. And so this grace comes through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. And then Paul here uses a relative clause, which makes it subordinate to this idea here, and whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And so this very important information here is subordinate to the main information found here in verse 21 and 22. And we're going to find out why Paul does this in another video. Paul is doing this to show what he means by the righteousness of God, to kind of clue us in on what he's talking about here, the righteousness of God. But we will leave that for another video and another day. His main idea here, the main idea of Paul, is what? It is number one, salvation is for Jew and Gentile alike. Why is that, Paul? Because both Jew and Gentile have sinned. And so, all who are saved, who are justified, are justified by grace. And so Paul, here in this passage, continues the argument that Jew and Gentile have the same need, that the Jew is not any better off before God. They have certain privileges because they've received God's oracles and received God's law, but they are not any better. Gentiles need the same thing that Jews need as well. It's a circular kind of thinking here, because Paul comes back to this in chapter 11. Paul actually tells the Gentile believers, hey, don't be puffed up, because the same thing that happened to the Jews will happen to you if you are. So let us all of us that are out there listening to this video, let us all realize that because of sin, we all have a need of God's grace. God is working out his plan and his purpose in the world, and he gave promises to the Jewish nation, promises that he's working out even now through the Messiah in all the world. Let us marvel at this. Let us see our need of God's grace to be the people that he has called us to be. And may God bless these words.